Serious. What do you think is the creepiest or most disturbing unsolved mystery ever? Story 1. The 1998 crimes of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope here in New Zealand were haunting. They'd been celebrating New Year at a lodge in the Marlborough Sounds when a stranger offered them a place to stay in his boat. That was the last time they were seen alive. After 5 months of investigation, they arrested a man named Scott Watson, who owned a boat in the same bay called the Blade. During their trial, they presented little actual evidence. Witnesses from the same water taxi used said that they weren't dropped off at the Blade. DNA from a hair sample, which could be proven to be Olivia's and had a hole in the bag, was presented, along with 2 prison inmates' claims that Scott admitted to them. Everything presented was as follows. Number 1. The main witness against Watson, Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver who supposedly dropped Watson, along with Smart and Hope, off on the Blade, now insists that it wasn't him. He claims he was hoodwinked into making the identification. Number 2. Wallace, along with everyone else who identified the guilty man, claimed he had at least medium-length, unkempt, wavy hair that evening. However, photographs taken that day show that Watson's hair was very short and trim. Number 3. Wallace and the other passengers at the time also insist that it wasn't the Blade they were dropped off onto. It was a much bigger boat, with complex rigging, a catch that you had to reach up from a water taxi, unlike the Blade. Furthermore, there were plenty of sightings of such a catch in Endeavour Inlet in the Sounds that New Year. Number 4. The evidence of Watson's arrival time at Erie Bay kept getting pushed back during the investigation, seemingly to give Watson time to steam out into the Cook Strait and dispose of them. But even with his arrival at its latest, and his boat speed at its maximum, the trip was physically impossible in that time frame. Number 5. The Crown's two-trip theory, sprung on the jury at the last moment, was that Watson had returned to the Blade at 2 a.m. and then gone back to shore, where he was seen at about 2:45 a.m. However, this is disproved by the occupants of the boat to which the Blade was tethered. Collectively, their evidence suggests that he arrived sometime around 3 a.m. and certainly not significantly earlier. Number 6. The police lied and said he scrubbed his boat clean. He did not. It was wiped down maybe 30%, as the police later admitted. This was easily explained by the normal cleaning of the boat in weeks after the police claimed he had committed the crime. Number 7. Prisoner A later recanted, saying the police visited A 10 times in the lead up to the trial, and he wanted out of prison at a later parole hearing because a gang member had threatened him. Thus, he lied, thinking the police would help him. Number 8. Prisoner B never recanted, but upon his release, the police gave him a car and cell phone as a gesture of gratitude for his testimony. Number 9. Also, it just so happens that their hair sample, supposedly belonging to Olivia, only turned up in the evidence bag collected from the Blade after the police searched her home. Before that, the hair sample did not exist. That's it. That's all it took to convict Scott. That and the police leaking that they were sure he did it, labeling him and his family as criminals, and making public allegations about him and his sister months before the trial even happened. Scott has filed numerous appeals, all of which have failed. The next one is due next month. In fact, he was eligible for parole in 2015, but because he still refuses to admit guilt, they won't release him. Many people in New Zealand think he didn't do it. I am one of them. Policing in New Zealand at the turn of the century and beforehand was a mess, with police activity lying in court to get what they wanted. I believe this is one of those times. Story 2. The quantity of crimes taking place along the highways in Texas between Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio is very frightening. Assessments indicate the potential presence of a full dozen distinct perpetrators operating in that region. The cause appears to be the remarkable amount of travel in that area. The number of people moving from one location to another for travel, commuting, visiting, and transporting goods is exceedingly high. Consequently, a girl disappears in one area, is slain in another, and then discarded in a third spot. The law enforcement officials who might discover it never establish contact with other authorities aware of her disappearance. Also, the people who were nearby and might have witnessed something were not locals but travelers. Police struggled to locate witnesses even within an hour after the crime, let alone weeks or months afterward. Moreover, travelers typically keep to themselves, making it harder for authorities to gather information. Some individuals appear to have found this area as an exceedingly successful hunting ground. Many people, particularly the poor, the unfortunate, the desperate, and the unwise, end up missing there. They simply vanish. Even if they are discovered, their identities remain unknown. No witnesses are ever interviewed and no crime scenes are ever identified. It's an exceptionally grim business. Someone mentioned the frightening aspect is that it could be someone standing right beside you. For me, what's chilling is that it could be your husband, father, brother, or boss. Just an ordinary middle-aged man, seemingly friendly and strong. Perhaps ex-military, possibly from the police force, or maybe not at all. He could be a softball coach or someone who occasionally travels for work out of town. Someone you're familiar with. That's the alarming aspect for me. Evil doesn't discriminate. It can lurk within the hearts of even the most angelic-looking people. Was this already freaky for you? We'll wait till you hear story 4. That's where things get seriously twisted. Story 3. In 1970, the Isdal woman, an unidentified woman, was discovered scorched in Norway, rendering her unidentifiable. Although authorities ruled it as self-inflicted, she possessed numerous counterfeit IDs and had been observing photographing military installations. However, the BBC podcast series, Death in Ice Valley, delves into this case. It's exceptionally well crafted and produced, to the point that it set a bar high for other mystery podcasts. I find myself constantly comparing them to them due to their thoroughness and quality. It's intriguing how details emerge even years after such incidents. In the Wikipedia entry, there's a paragraph recounting an account from a Bergen resident in 2005. This person, aged 26 in 1970, recalled seeing a woman while hiking in the hillside of Floyen, just 5 days before the discovery of the Isidol woman's remains. What struck him was that she appeared to be dressed more for the city than for a hike, and was walking ahead of two men in coats who appeared southern. The woman seemed resigned and almost ready to say something to him, but refrained. Despite his attempt to report this to someone in the police force, he was advised to dismiss it. It's a puzzling and unsettling detail in an already enigmatic case. The context seems to suggest a clear narrative. That she was a spy who was discovered, fled unaware of the consequences if caught, ingested several pills, hoping for an easy way out. However, before these pills could take effect, she was discovered, and knowing that there were no other options, it speculated that the men may have deliberately ended her life, mirroring the fate of Joan of Arc. Story 4. In 1987, two boys from Arkansas, Don Henry and Kevin Ives, tragically lost their lives when they were struck by a train. Curiously, they didn't attempt to move from the tracks despite the oncoming train. According to the train operator, they were positioned across the tracks and didn't respond to the blaring emergency brakes and the honking horn. The train continued for 1,000 feet past the point of impact, leaving behind a devastating scene. Police discovered a .22 and a flashlight near the boys, but no other evidence was found at the scene. The autopsy revealed that the boys had consumed a quantity of a substance equivalent to smoking 20 doobies, causing them to lose consciousness on the tracks. Consequently, authorities concluded the incident to be an accident. The parents, in disagreement with the initial findings, hired new investigators. A second autopsy conducted out of state suggested that perhaps the boys had only smoked the equivalent of 2 doobies. This revelation led to a change in status to probable homicide. Subsequent investigations revealed a wound in the back of Don Henry, aligning with the shirt's pattern. Additionally, Kevin Ives seemed to have suffered disfigurement from his own weapon, with evidence such as hair and red matter present in the object. Kevin Ives' father supported this notion because he had personally educated his son about firearms and found it unlikely that Kevin would carelessly lay his rifle in gravel, causing scratches. The ultimate theory that emerged was linked to trafficking. It was speculated that the boys might have inadvertently come across a transaction taking place and were subsequently silenced to prevent any revelation of the illegal activity. The prosecutor who mishandled the case later faced allegations of involvement in the crime. This revelation occurred subsequent to his implication in lawful dealings and the suspicion that he might have purposely destroyed evidence that could have potentially provided a breakthrough in solving the case. Another person implicated in the case met a tragic end shortly after being identified. Several witnesses who came forward subsequently passed away under suspicious circumstances. Strikingly, the autopsies for all these individuals, including those implicated in the crime, were conducted by the same person who performed the autopsies for the boys. Consequently, the case went cold and has remained unresolved since 1988. I live approximately 10 miles away from where the boys were discovered, prompting my mother to enforce a rule of not allowing us outside after dark. During that period, I was in middle school and had known Kevin Ives through baseball. Nothing's messier than a tangled web of lies, all to shield the bad guys. Ever been intrigued by an unsolved mystery? Share in the comments. And if my stories give you goosebumps, don't forget to hit subscribe. Let's walk deeper into the darkness. Story 5. The case of the woman of Warz is haunting. Over 300, possibly 500 women in Mexico tragically lost their lives, yet there have been no answers regarding the perpetrators. Every time someone made strides in the investigation, progress seemed to come to an abrupt halt. Interestingly, it was often an American detective who attempted to delve deeper, but once the investigation crossed into Mexico, it seemed to vanish. This situation gives the impression of a huge scandal waiting to be unveiled. I hail from Warz and experienced firsthand the peak of the femicides. Law enforcement made minimal efforts to probe the disappearances and showed even less interest when women were eventually discovered, many bearing signs of torment. Worried parents consistently receiving explanations suggesting their daughters had run away or become entangled in despite some of the missing women being employed at local factories. It's noteworthy that NAFTA signing in 1994 triggered a substantial population surge in Juarez, coinciding with a disturbing increase in crimes and disappearances during that period. It was distressingly common for families to be informed of a woman's discovery, only for it to later emerge, sometimes years later, that it wasn't their daughter but another unfortunate girl. Even to this day, women continue to be found, identified as girls who went missing in the 90s. Families had to rely on gossip for any updates about the missing women, and I remember the myriad of theories regarding their fates. There were speculations about involvement from psychos and dirty rich sons. In the 2000s, there was a belief that it was connected to gang activity. The reality likely lies somewhere between these extremes, but due to numerous botched investigations and neglected cases, the truth remains elusive. and we may never know what truly happened. Story 6. Ilenia Carisi, the daughter of two famous Italian singers, Albano and Romina Power, mysteriously disappeared in 1994 in New Orleans. Her mother firmly believes she's still alive, while her father believes she's drowned in the Mississippi. I don't have any concrete theories about this one, but I can offer my insight into New Orleans during that period. The city at the time had one of the highest crime rates in the country and quite possibly the most corrupt police force ever. Within 2 years of this disappearance, 2 separate police officers were convicted. One of them orchestrated an attack on a woman who had filed a brutality complaint against him, while the other officer harmed her own partner to carry out a restaurant robbery. The mob in New Orleans at that point was essentially inactive. I suppose it's plausible that actual Italian criminals arrived, but it would have been much simpler for them to enter in Mexico rather than in the US. The musicians and street people she associated with wouldn't have had the means to conceal it. Our presumption is that she stumbled upon some corrupt police operation and they silenced her. Once they realized she was too well known for the crime to be easily concealed, they disposed of her in the swamp. I believe it's because alligators are rather indolent and don't actively hunt, but they readily consume carrion. New Orleans is encircled by swamps, offering thousands of locations within a 15-mile radius of the city where someone could dispose of something. Never underestimate the darkness that blooms in the shadow of authority. Story 7. The case of Harry Horse and Mandy Horn. The inconsistent and blatantly false news reports made a complete mess of the situation. I believe Nexpo's video on the matter nicely gathers all the information. For those who aren't aware, Harry Horse was an English author, illustrator, singer, and political cartoonist living in Scotland with his wife Mandy. Mandy's health declined rapidly due to multiple sclerosis, with Harry taking on the role of her primary caregiver. On the night of the incident, 2 friends were visiting the couple. This is where the accounts from witnesses start to differ. Harry was known for his mood swings and strange remarks, especially on that night. He's reported to have made a comment that sounded like, "It's a wonderful night for an ending." Mandy pleaded with the 2 friends to stay, but they departed. The friends stated they had left a jacket behind, so they returned to the house after some time. Upon their return, they found the door open and were met with a grisly scene. The Pats had also been harmed. Unfortunately, Mandy met a gruesome fate while Harry suffered heavily. Initially, this was reported as a Romeo and Juliet love pact. Later, it was described as a dual fatality caused by one person's actions. It was claimed that Harry had ingested a great deal of substances before committing the crime. However, Harry's autopsy reported a complete absence of said substances. The door being open, the friends forgetting a jacket on the infamously cold Shetland Islands, nobody having the slightest clue what happened. None of it adds up in my mind. Story 8. This one is particularly haunting as the girl remained alive for several hours after being attacked. The Hinterkaifeck crimes resulted in the tragic loss of an entire family, including 2 young people. The perpetrators then stayed at their house for 2 days, lighting fires in the fireplace, consuming their food, and tending to their animals. Remarkably, to this day, no one has discovered the identity of the perpetrators or the motive behind these heinous acts. The girl, alive for several hours after the incident, was observed pulling at her own hair. Experts suggest this action might have been a response to the trauma she endured, potentially suffering from brain damage and lacking the ability to sense anything. In her final moments, she seemed to be grasping at the only thing within reach. Perhaps unaware it was her hair due to her inability to feel it. In a comprehensive report about American soldiers in Iraq, it was noted that in instances where they fired at young ones, the targets would exhibit distressing behaviors. They would tug at their clothes, pull their hair, pinch their skin, or dig their feet into the dirt until they're passing. These actions were interpreted as a response to their lack of sensation, as they seemingly didn't know what else to do in their final moments. Story 9. The Yuba County Five. A group of 5 men, each dealing with their own mental health challenges, were on their way home one night when they unexpectedly veered into a remote wilderness area. Following that turn, there was no further contact from them. However, a witness reported seeing a group of people exiting a vehicle and walking away while he was experiencing a heart attack inside his own car. Later on, the remains of 4 out of 5 were found, but Gary Matthews still has not been located. One of them was in a ranger shack which had plenty of food and supplies. The other 3 were found scattered throughout the woods, all having succumbed to hypothermia. The shack could have sustained them all long enough to be found, but 4 of them decided to leave it. Nobody knows where they took that turn, got out of their car, or left the shack. Nobody knows. Theories are all that can be spread. But for me, the creepiest part is that Gary Matthews was never found. Story 10. Brandon Swanson's case always boggled my mind. The fact that he alerted his parents that he was lost and needed help, and they were on the way and on the phone with him only to hear his last moments. To know they were so close but they still haven't found him is terrifying. I think he was run over by farming equipment. The people who owned the land where they thought he was refused to let anyone search the property. Story 11. All the unsolved mysteries surrounding Epstein's Island are pretty unsettling, considering the numerous high-profile individuals visited, yet nothing substantial ever emerged from it. I was researching Epstein's case for a podcast, and at a certain point, it abruptly halted. The trail goes cold, which in itself is quite suspicious. Both Epstein and his clients were extremely wealthy and powerful, including a UK prince. It goes cold because the FBI searched the island and confiscated his safe along with everything else. It's presumed that the safe contained his client list and contact info, or at the very least, the FBI recovered that. The US government, specifically the DOJ, has everything. They possess all the information about it. That's why nobody's going to find anything. The US government holds all the evidence. I understand, though I don't agree with withholding it, as the list surely contains names of powerful leaders and perhaps heads of state. Additionally, it involves some of our allies, such as Prince Andrew, the brother of the King of England. I imagine our government attempting to use it to obtain concessions from other countries, which was the primary objective behind it all. One of the girls who worked at Epstein's Pleasure Palace in West Palm Beach mentioned she wandered into a room with numerous monitors displaying cameras in each room. She mentioned the cameras were so tiny you wouldn't know they were there. Undoubtedly, he was using them to blackmail people. That's why he did it. What bothers me about this is that the cover-up happened right in front of all of us, in broad daylight, and just went away. It's bad enough that all this happened, but then to gaslight us after the fact adds an extra level. Story 12. The disappearance of Asha Degree has always troubled me. I can't understand how she might have been influenced to leave her home. The young ones appear to be kept very isolated except for school, with minimal interaction beyond extended family and the church. This leads me to believe she was probably very naive for her age, and someone with ill intentions at the school, church, or even within the extended family, considering most abductions are committed by people the victims know closely, might have convinced her to take the actions she did. There isn't an extensive amount of detail about her family life, but I also wonder if home life wasn't rather strict. Parents who are stringent about school, family, church, and no one else might have created an environment that a girl felt compelled to rebel against. The scenario could potentially align well with the intentions of a predator lurking within the family or a close friend from the church. I've always considered that something out of that nature might have prompted her to leave the house. However, if she didn't get lost in the woods and succumb to exposure, or if she didn't fall somewhere, especially given her found possessions, it's possible she lost them during her panicked run. Later, she might have made it back to the road without them, or she possibly encountered the person who convinced her to be out there in the first place. She wasn't lost, you see. She just found herself and followed the echo of her own rebellion, screaming amidst the silence. Story 13. The Zodiac Killer, to be honest. I'm sure there's more I don't entirely know about, but the anonymity of never knowing is unsettling to me. The way he would send things to the police too is so interesting to me. And as a cherry on top, the abrupt stop after it all. The obvious intelligence of the perpetrator, coupled with absolutely unreal levels of narcissism, leaves you waiting for a moment of, another narcissist that overplayed his hand. But it just never happens, despite the crazy lengths of taunting and baiting. It's certainly a wild case. It's hard to discern if it was about power tripping, perpetrating, seeking recognition, something else, or all of the above. And whatever it was, it's incredibly rare for someone with such a mental state to just stop. Did they pass away suddenly? Story 14. The Princess in the Tower refers to two young sons of King Edward IV who vanished while residing in the Tower of London, under the guardianship of their uncle Richard, who later became King Richard III. In the 1600s, remains were discovered under a staircase in the tower. They were assumed to be the boys and were buried in an urn in Westminster Abbey. However, those bones had never undergone DNA testing, and thus, we do not know if they belonged to the boys. Story 15. The case involved Native women in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Last year alone, Indigenous women accounted for nearly 20% of all homicides in the city, despite comprising just 6% of the population. Police in Canada have said they don't have the resources to search a landfill to recover the bodies of two Indigenous women slain by an alleged perpetrator, a decision that has left the daughters of one victim heartbroken and angry. Mentioned a Guardian news article. The fact that the government has offered to allocate funds for searching the landfill, yet the provincial government still won't do it, is infuriating. Additionally, Indigenous women accounted for every unsolved female homicide in the last 5 years. Story 16. The Black Dahlia case is incredibly disturbing. It's evidently the work of a psycho, yet it's treated as a strange, isolated incident. Forensics haven't made any progress due to the ham-fisted investigations. The girl's reputation was smeared with proof or reason, and it's been so long ago now that nobody really cares. I keep coming back to how the perpetrator would have needed a place of utmost privacy, where he knew he wouldn't be interrupted, where no one would hear her screams, and where he had at least basic tools. If you looked up the Black Dahlia's pictures, you'd really think the perpetrator's got a mix of surgeon finesse and animal savagery. Ready for more terrifying stories that happened on deserted highways? If so, don't miss Truckers. What are your scary late-night experiences? Story 3 is a nightmare. Join me there, if you dare.